Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of the Gospels in our continuing study of the life of Christ. When we go from the Old Testament to the New Testament, we find out that 400 years have passed and the world has changed completely. It's a different world, so that we're looking at different geographical regions. Instead of focusing on Mesopotamia and the Middle East, our gaze is going to begin, yes, still in Israel, but switch to the west to look to places like Greece and Rome. There's going to be different languages involved. The Old Testament, largely written in Hebrew, there's a few chapters in Aramaic, but the New Testament is written entirely in the Greek language, because this had become the new common language. There were different national invaders in the Old Testament. As the Old Testament comes to a close, it was the Persians who were in charge of the world. They were running the known world. When our New Testament opens, it has now become Rome that is the big superpower. There's different types of literature that are now known to people. And I think literature makes its impact upon world and world culture. So we have these 400 silent years beginning around 400 BC. That's the time about which the Old Testament is completed, with the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, being penned around that time. We're not sure of the exact date. And notice I put around 5. I could maybe go as early as spring of 4 BC for the birth of Jesus. A period of 400 years. And we call them 400 silent years, not because God had gone on vacation, but because the prophets had stopped. There are no prophets prophesying or prophets writing scripture. There are writings that are taking place, but it's understood even within the scope of those writings that these are not coming from prophets. One of the big events that we begin with in the year 331 BC is Alexander the Great conquering the Persian Empire. Within the space of 10 years, beginning in 333 all the way to 323, he went from Macedonia down to Egypt, across Mesopotamia, all the way to the borders of India before coming back. Within the space of 10 years, this young man conquered the entire known world. Looking at some of his initial travels, coming from Macedonia in 332 BC, he comes down to Tyre, and each city to which he would come, his policy was always the same: open your doors, your gates to me. I will now be your ruler. I'm self-styling myself as a liberator, and you can pretty much continue with life as you had before. Only from now on, you pay taxes to me. And that was a very effective way of presenting himself until he came down to the city of Tyre. And he reaches Tyre, and Tyre's an island city off the coast. And so Tyre says, no, we're not going to open our gates to you. And Alexander says, well, we'll see about that. And he besieges the city. Now, it's a city that is located both on the mainland and an island city off the coast. And he besieges the city for a period of 7 months and builds a causeway, because he didn't have much in the way of a navy, builds a causeway from the mainland out to the island, showing the determination of this young man. And he captures the city of Tyre. Its inhabitants, those that survive, are carried off into slavery. And in doing so, he is fulfilling a prophecy of the scripture in Ezekiel chapter 26 that promises how the city of Tyre would be taken and the very stones of its walls would be cast into the sea. I don't think Alexander had that in mind, but he inadvertently fulfilled that prophecy. So Tyre falls July 29, 332 BC after a 7-month siege, and then he continues southward toward Jerusalem. The story goes, and it's told in the book of, it's told by Josephus, I'm sorry, I started to say book of Maccabees, it's probably mentioned there too. in Josephus' Antiquities, he talks about how Alexander came. Actually, he sent a contingent up to Jerusalem, and they made the same mistake that Tyre had made. No, you can't come in here. And so the story goes, he came with his army to destroy Jerusalem, and the high priest, along with a number of other priests, a whole procession of priests, came out to meet him, carrying the scroll of the book of Daniel. I pick up here from Josephus. He says, and when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and he was then glad. And what he does, he spares the city of Jerusalem. He allows them a measure of self-rule. Of course, you're going to pay your taxes to Alexander. And he goes on his way. So that within the space of 10 years, Alexander has conquered the known world, and he brings about a great amount of cultural interchange from east to west. That is not only the language, but there are cultural icons, the idea of having theater and games and sports that different people are observe and are involved in. That comes from Alexander. Scientific learning increases. He had as his tutor when he was young Aristotle, and he had gained from Aristotle the interest in all things scientific, and so there traveled with him a host of scientists and map makers and people of all sorts of learning. Hellenization, and that's just another word for Greekization. Hellas is what the Greeks call their country even today. And he brings this Greek culture and this Greek influence into the ancient world. It will change the world. The Greek language is a part of that, so that, as we noted before, our New Testament is written in Greek, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. But now Greek is having its impact. This is the language of the educated. As Alexander dies, and he's only in his early 30s when he gets sick and dies, we're not sure, was he poisoned? Did his riotous living catch up with him? We're not sure why, but he was in Babylon at the time of his death. His generals gathered around him and asked, "To whom do you give your kingdom?" And he whispered out, "To the strongest," which meant there was going to be a power struggle after his death, and there was. The empire of Alexander scattered in a number of different directions. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt to the south. Cassander and Lysimachus grabbed Thrace and Macedonia. And having said that, I'm not going to mention them again. There was a king by the king. He was actually one of Alexander's generals, Antigonus the One-Eyed, who made an attempt to grab Mesopotamia and Anatolia, but he's not going to hold on to it. Instead, the other kings come up against him, one of them being Seleucus, who had been one of Ptolemy's generals. And Seleucus and Ptolemy win the battles, but Seleucus takes for himself that territory, doesn't give it back to Ptolemy. And so these are going to be the two big power brokers for the next couple of hundred years. There's Ptolemy in Egypt, and all of his descendants will be named Ptolemy, all the way down to the very last one, who will break the mold and will be known as Cleopatra. But all of the sons of Ptolemy will be called Ptolemy the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on. And then I have the Seleucids. Now there are going to be a number of different names there, and we'll see a few of them, ruling Mesopotamia and also ruling Anatolia, that portion of country that we call Turkey today. Ptolemy Philadelphus, he's the second of the Ptolemies, and he's significant for our study because he does some things that have an impact. First of all, he's just known in history as building a great lighthouse. The Pharos Lighthouse in Alexandria was known as one of the wonders of the world, and certainly a great achievement. He also built a library at Alexandria that became, if it wasn't one of the wonders of the world, it should have been, where books from all over the world were collected. And Ptolemy II wanted every book in the world in his library. It is said that if a ship came into port at Alexandria, that there were inspectors who would go aboard the ship not looking for contraband, but looking for books. And any books that they found, they would take them off, they would copy those books, and then they would return the copies back to the ship, and they would keep the originals in the library at Alexandria. One of the books that Ptolemy wanted was the Hebrew Bible, but he could not read Hebrew, so he ordered that the Hebrew Bible be translated into Greek. Tradition has it that there were 70 Jewish translators working on this translation, and so it became known as the 70, or the way you say that is the Septus, the Septuagint, and that refers to this Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Ptolemy eventually goes to war with the Seleucids, and you have a series of wars that go back and forth with Ptolemy in the south and the Seleucids. In fact, eventually we're going to see one of the Seleucids, Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, and these two kingdoms are at war with little tiny Israel wedged in between them, and that's going to have an impact on the Jews. Well, Antiochus III is doing well until he meets up with the Romans, and they defeat him, and as a result his son has to go and be a hostage in Rome. And his son is Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Now that was a title he gave himself. Epiphanes is the magnificent one. The Jews are going to give him another nickname. They're going to refer to him as Antiochus Epimanes, Antiochus the Madman. We'll see why in just a moment. He is forced to be a hostage in Rome, and when his father dies, he escapes from Rome. Now, when I say he's a hostage, that doesn't mean he's in prison or in chains. Rather, it's a very comfortable hostage, sort of like what we read about in the book of Daniel, when Daniel was a hostage in Babylon. He was in the king's house. Now, there wasn't any kings in Rome, so Antiochus was I wouldn't even say under house arrest, but he's living in Rome. He's being educated there. He's got a Roman roommate, and he's doing okay. But he escapes Rome to go back when his father dies to become the new king of the Seleucid dynasty. And so he escapes, he returns, and he decides he's going to be another Alexander the Great. And the way he begins, he's going to campaign against Egypt. And so he gathers his army, he moves down through Israel, down into Egypt. On the way, he meddles a bit in Jewish both politics and religion in ways he probably shouldn't have been doing. But he campaigns against Egypt, and he is eminently successful. He has virtually conquered Egypt. He is about to take Alexandria, the capital. He has Ptolemy, one of the Ptolemies, holed up in the city, and coming out to meet him from the city is a Roman legate all by himself. This Roman ambassador comes to him, and Antiochus reaches out his hand to greet him, and the Roman magistrate hands him a scroll saying, "This is from the Senate and people of Rome. Rome wants you out of Egypt. Go away. Go home." And Antiochus says, "Well, I'll give that some thought." And the Roman magistrate says, "You can think about it all you want," draws a circle around him on the sand, "but give me your answer before you step out of that circle." Antiochus is a little intimidated because he's been to Rome. He's seen what Rome is like. He knows all about Rome, and he says, "Okay, I'm leaving." And so he returns home, and he's on his way home when he finds out that news of his death. Now, he hadn't died, but a rumor had gotten out that he had died, and there's a revolt in Judah. And Antiochus wants to take, he's frustrated, he wants to take his anger out on someone, and he comes to Jerusalem, and he marches into the temple, kills a bunch of the Jews, and he says, "From now on there's going to be a change, no more Judaism. I'm going to impose these regulations. First of all, Jews are no longer allowed to assemble for prayer. If you're going to pray, you pray individually, and I want you to not pray to this God that you've been praying to. I want you to pray to Zeus. and so observance of the Sabbath is forbidden, and possession of the scriptures are illegal, and circumcision is illegal. We're going to stamp out Judaism once and for all. Dietary laws are illegal, and to see that this is carried out, he orders contingents of soldiers to go around the country, setting up altars to Zeus, and slaying a pig on the altar, and everybody come and partake of this sacrifice. Pagan sacrifices, therefore, are mandated, and everybody is required to participate, and those who do not are tortured and put to death. Well, Antiochus IV is involved in this, and meanwhile his soldiers, he's gone back up to Seleucus, meanwhile his soldiers are carrying out this policy, and they come to a little town called Modin, just north of Jerusalem. And they set up the altar, and they take the pig that's going to be sacrificed upon the altar, and they call the townspeople together. And one aged priest, Mattathias, and his sons have gathered around, and he is so angered at this blasphemy, and he marches up, grabs the sacrificial knife, and instead of sacrificing the pig, he begins fighting against the Seleucids. And they go to arrest him, and his sons jump into the battle fray, and before anyone knows it, a revolt has broken out, the Maccabean Revolt. Now it's called the Maccabean Revolt because they had hammered the Seleucids in that town. The way you say that is that's from the word macabre, and so they're known as the Maccabeans, the hammer strikes against the Seleucids. It takes place in 167 BC, and Mattathias, he's not going to live much longer after this. He's an old man. But his sons take up the challenge, and one of his sons in particular, Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, continues this revolt, and eventually they liberate the temple and cleanse the temple. In fact, that is celebrated by the Jews every year at Hanukkah. That's called the Feast of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication, where they celebrate the cleansing, liberation, and rededication of the temple. The war doesn't stop there. It just begins. And eventually the Maccabean rebellion, it takes a number of years of fighting, but eventually it succeeds in liberating the Jews, where they are now under their own leaders. Now initially they are under the Maccabean priests, because remember Mattathias had been a priest and his sons were priests. And these priests eventually are looked up to by people, by the Jews, as their leaders. And eventually, they don't do it immediately, but on down after a few decades, they begin to refer to themselves not just as priests, but as kings. And so we refer to these as the Hasmonean kings. Hasmonean because they're from the house of Hashmon. I guess we could call them the Maccabean kings, but that would be the nickname. And they're going to rule for about 100 years. But meanwhile, Rome is on the horizon. Rome has already made itself felt known by ordering Antiochus out of Egypt, and Rome is becoming a bigger and bigger power. It finally comes to a head with Pompey the Great. He called himself that, and I guess the name caught on because we're still using the title as well today. And he had been commissioned by the Romans to clear the seas of piracy. They gave him a 5-year commission, and he completed the job in about 3 months, which left him 4 years and change to do whatever he wanted. And he went to the east, conquered Syria, and while he's in Syria, he receives a message from 2 of the Maccabeans, 2 of the Hasmoneans. Actually, it was 2 brothers. Their father had been the king, and after their father had died, their mother had ruled in his place for a bit, but now she had died, and they're fighting over who's going to be king, these 2 brothers. And they each send messengers to Pompey, and some other Jews do as well, will you please get rid of this brother of mine? And he says, okay. And Pompey comes down, and he conquers Jerusalem in the year 63 BC. Goes into the temple just to see what's there, into the Holy of Holies, in fact, but it's now long since been empty. Back in the Old Testament times, it had had the Ark of the Covenant there, but that hadn't been the case since the first fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Pompey now makes some territorial arrangements, in that instead of a nation of Israel, there will be these various territories in Canaan. First of all, there will be Judea in the south, the land of the Jews. There will be Samaria as a separate designated province, because the people living here are sort of part Jewish, part something else. There is Galilee, situated around the Sea of Galilee in the north. And to the east of the Sea of Galilee is the Decapolis. The deca, like a decimal point, means 10, and a polis is a city, so that's the 10 cities. 10 Greek cities, actually, because of the large Greek influence on the east side of the Jordan River. Pompey doesn't quite trust the Jews to rule over themselves, and so he finds an able man by the name of Antipater, who is an Idumean. The Idumeans, from Edom to the south, had been annexed by the Jews in an earlier generation, and so Antipater is looked at by an outsider as, well, he's just one of that country. The Jews didn't view him as such. And Antipater, is given the position of procurator, so that his job is to procure taxes for Rome. And as such, Antipater puts two of his sons in charge of the various provinces. Faisal, his oldest son, is in charge of Judea, and he has a young son, barely 20 years old, by the name of Herod, who is put in charge of Galilee. And things go for a while, but then Antipater dies. When Antipater dies, that becomes the spark for an invasion from the east of a people known as the Parthians, cousins to the Persians. And with the help of Jewish agitators, who, after all, don't really like the idea that Antipater and his sons, Idumeans, have been exercising authority over them, Faisal is captured and killed, and Herod, they attempt to capture him, but he manages to escape. He runs down to Petra, and from there to Egypt, and from there makes his way all the way to Rome. In Rome, he goes before the Senate. He is sponsored by Octavius Augustus and Mark Antony. Julius Caesar has died just a few years earlier. And the Roman Senate makes Herod the king of the Jews, and gives him a Roman legion to go back and recapture the territory for Rome. And Herod is as good as his word. He goes back, takes him a couple of 3 years, and by 37 BC he has captured Israel and now becomes its king, Herod the Great. One of the early things that Herod does, he begins to rebuild and outfit the temple. Now, back in Zerubbabel's day, right after the Babylonian captivity, the temple had been rebuilt. It had seen an expansion in the days of the Seleucids, with a fortress known as the Acra Fortress on its southern section. It had been further expanded in the days of the Hasmoneans, but now it is going to see tremendous expansion in all directions, both the temple itself and the outlying areas. There'll be an Antonia fortress on the north, named after Marcus Antonius, one of the Romans that had sponsored Herod. There will be bridges and gates leading up to the Temple Mount from every direction. Herod also builds a harbor at Caesarea. Israel has no natural harbors, and so he builds an artificial breakwater, in which was a major feat of architectural triumph. You can go to Caesarea today, and concerts to this day are still held in the theater that was originally built by Herod the Great. There were no natural springs there, and so water was piped in on 3 huge aqueducts, bringing water from as far away as 10, 15 miles away from the mountains. However, it's not long before Herod begins to run into some troubles, domestic troubles in particular. Herod had married the last surviving princess of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. And he married her, and it seems that he also fell in love with her. Had several sons by her, and it's not long before he begins to uncover plots aimed at killing him and putting his 2 sons in power in his place. And so Herod has 2 of his sons and then another son murdered. In fact, he had killed so many of his sons that Octavius Augustus, the emperor of Rome, quipped that it's better to be Herod's hus than to be Herod's huios, that it is better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, because after all, Herod didn't eat pigs. They were an unclean animal, but Herod had rather gobbled up his own sons. So as we come to a close, notice we've spanned this 400 silent years. We had the Old Testament completed. We had Alexander the Great coming on the scene. We had the Hellenistic kings, in particular the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, followed by the Maccabean revolt, where the Jews for a time won their independence and were ruled over by the Hasmonean kings, and that came to an end with Pompey the Great, and now Rome is on the scene. And as our New Testament is about to begin, we have the death of Herod the Great in the year 4 BC. Now let's talk a bit about first century Judaism. There were 4 major sects, and then there was just the greater mass of people that didn't really fit into any one of these. Maybe you could describe them as being right in the middle. You had on the one hand the Sadducees. This was the ultra-Orthodox, at least that's how they viewed themselves. They had their presence especially in the temple, and they were all concerned with what you did in the temple, with the sacrifices, and the scriptures to which they held was the law of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. If it came after that, well, they didn't give it that much credence. So that things that are only mentioned later in the Old Testament, like the resurrection, they discounted that. They didn't hold to that as being authoritative. They denied the existence of angels, resurrection. It's almost as though they were more interested in what do you do in the temple, what kind of sacrifice you do, have I got that right? And if you do, then everything else is just up for grabs. Sometimes we look at them and we think, well, they look like maybe the liberal party that had been influenced by Hellenistic culture. I think they would have been shocked by such a suggestion. Rather, they viewed themselves as the ultra-Orthodox. There were also the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, the word Pharisee comes from a term meaning to separate. And they were trying to separate themselves from evil and from sin. And this was actually I'm going to call them the liberal party, not in a secular sense, but they saw religion as having changed a bit. That is, you had not only the law of Moses, but then you had the rest of the Old Testament and the oral law and the traditions. And they sought to follow everything. They were the ultra-religious people, at least in their minds. Sadducees and Pharisees didn't quite see eye to eye. The Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. The Pharisees did. Because that's described later in the Old Testament. The Sadducees, they weren't so sure angels existed. The Pharisees were firm believers in angels. But there were two other groups we need to mention. The Essenes. The Essenes looked at both the Sadducees and the Pharisees and thought neither one of them went far enough. They looked at those groups as being far too worldly for their tastes, and so they had left town. They didn't care for the Sadducees and what had gone on with the Hasmoneans and the kings and the priests and all. And so they rejected that priesthood, and they said, you have the wrong priests, and they're changing some of the days where you worship, and we don't care for any of that. So they had gone down by the shores of the Dead Sea and had set up a little tiny community. And there they were, happily unto themselves. One of the benefits of the Essenes is that they made copies of the scriptures, copies that continue to this day, and were recently rediscovered in the late 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we owe them quite a bit when it comes to those very early copies of the scriptures. The fourth group were the Zealots. These were the folks who were the nationalists of the day. They said if we could only get rid of Rome, then everyone would be happy. We want political stability. Actually, they needed some instability to get there. They needed to conquer Rome. And they were all about, I'd rather fight if I'm going to be right. And so you have these four sort of poles, and the vast amount of people were somewhere in the middle of that. Most people were not Sadducees or Pharisees or Essenes or Zealots. These were relatively small groups, but they were the extremes, with most people somewhere in the middle. It is said that the Pharisees enjoyed a great amount of popularity of the people. Zealots, well, they were troublemakers. And certainly they had their following. The Essenes were out in the desert. You really didn't hear too much of them. The Sadducees, they were ruling the temple. They were the aristocracy. Well, that completes our background lesson. Hopefully that hasn't put you to sleep. And now we're ready to begin our study of the life of Christ.